In war, movement is life, and movement is death. Every step reveals intent. Every reaction creates a target. In open terrain, this truth is obvious. In the jungle, it becomes absolute. The Pacific jungle was not a battlefield designed for clarity. It swallowed sound. It broke lines of sight. It turned distance into guesswork and made every decision feel delayed. Soldiers did not fight what they saw. They fought what they thought they saw, and that difference mattered. For the men operating there, the most dangerous moment was not the firefight. It was the pause before one, the second when something felt wrong, a glint where no metal should be, a sound without a source, a pattern that did not belong. Armies train their soldiers to react, to identify threats, to investigate anomalies. That training keeps units alive under normal conditions. But under the wrong conditions, it becomes a vulnerability. By late 1943, American units in the Pacific were facing an invisible problem. Enemy observers were watching everything. Movement between positions, supply runs, command coordination. Marines were being killed not because they were careless, but because they were being seen first. And every attempt to find the observers exposed more men. This created a stalemate of perception. If you moved openly, you were spotted. If you searched carefully, you were targeted. If you did nothing, you surrendered the initiative. The jungle rewarded patience, but punished inaction. Traditional solutions failed. Artillery was useless against enemies you could not see. Patrols triggered ambushes. Countersnipers could not find targets that refused to behave predictably. Every method assumed the enemy would make a mistake. They did not. The real advantage lay elsewhere, not in firepower, but in attention. Human attention has limits. It is drawn to contrast, to change, to the unexpected. In an environment where everything was green, dark, and still, anything that broke that pattern became irresistible. Soldiers did not choose to notice. Their brains did it for them. This is where the battlefield quietly shifted. Instead of trying to locate the enemy directly, a different approach emerged. One that did not ask, "Where are they?" but "What will they react to?" The objective was no longer to find targets. It was to create them. This required understanding the enemy, not as marksmen, but as decision-makers. Men trained to observe. Men whose job depended on responding to signals. Men who could not afford to ignore anything that might be intelligence. The jungle amplified this pressure. Visibility was limited. Communication was fragile. Missing information could be fatal. Ignoring a signal could mean missing an attack. Acting on a false one could mean death. Every choice carried risk. This was the paradox. The enemy could not safely investigate, but they could not safely ignore. Their doctrine offered no answer, because doctrine assumes patterns, and this situation had none. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense. There were no charges, no dramatic assaults. Instead, there was a quiet manipulation of perception, a series of small, deliberate disturbances designed to provoke response. Light where there should be none, sound without movement, signals without meaning. Each disturbance asked the same silent question: "Will you look?" And every time someone did, the jungle answered. By the time commanders realized what was happening, the damage was already spreading. Units hesitated. Orders conflicted. Soldiers began to doubt their own senses. The battlefield was no longer a place you could read. It became a place that read you. This is where the story truly begins. Not with a weapon, but with an idea. Not with overwhelming force, but with a decision to stop fighting the enemy's strengths and start exploiting their instincts. To understand how this worked, we need to examine how a simple act of deception can trigger a chain reaction that grows far beyond a single shot. Because once attention is weaponized, every response becomes predictable. And once responses become predictable, control quietly changes hands. To understand why this form of deception was so effective, you first have to understand what soldiers are trained to value: not bravery, not aggression, information. On a battlefield, information is survival. Knowing where the enemy is, what they are doing, and what they are about to do determines who lives and who dies. This is especially true in environments where visibility is limited and communication is unreliable. The jungle magnified this reality. In dense terrain, armies cannot rely on sweeping vision or long-range fire. They rely on observation. Small signs matter: a disturbed branch, a flash of metal, a shadow that moves against the wind. These are not details, they are warnings. Military training conditions soldiers to react to anomalies. Anything unusual might indicate enemy movement, reconnaissance, or preparation for attack. Ignoring such signs can be catastrophic. Investigating them, however, carries its own risk. This tension sits at the heart of all battlefield decision-making. Normally, doctrine resolves this tension. It provides rules. How many men to send, from what angle, under what cover. But doctrine assumes that anomalies are genuine signals. It does not account for signals created solely to manipulate attention. That is the crack this method exploited. The jungle itself made the deception possible. In most environments, reflections and sounds have context. In cities, light bounces everywhere. In open fields, movement is constant. In the jungle, nothing behaves randomly. Light is absorbed, sound is muffled, motion stands out. This meant that even the smallest disruption carried disproportionate weight. A brief flash was not noise. It was information, or at least, it looked like information. The key was not intensity, but restraint. The disturbances were never dramatic. They did not resemble flares or gunfire. They were subtle enough to feel accidental, yet precise enough to feel intentional. This ambiguity forced interpretation. Human brains are wired to resolve uncertainty. When faced with an unexplained signal, people do not default to ignoring it. They default to explaining it. And explanation requires observation. Once observation begins, behavior changes. Soldiers shift position. They lean out. They raise binoculars. They communicate. In doing so, they break concealment. The deception worked because it did not attack strength. It attacked habit. Enemy observers were disciplined. They followed procedures. They avoided predictable exposure. But they were still human. Their role required them to look, to confirm, to report. They could not treat every anomaly as meaningless. Their entire purpose was to interpret signs. This created a structural vulnerability. The more professional the observer, the harder it was to ignore potential intelligence. As the method evolved, it became clear that randomness alone was not enough. True paralysis required structure. Patterns began to matter. Signals that repeated suggested coordination. Coordination suggested command. Command suggested intent. Suddenly, the enemy was not just reacting to strange lights or sounds. They were reacting to what those disturbances might represent. This is where the deception crossed a threshold. It stopped being a trick and became a simulation. Simulated communication implied planning. Simulated planning implied movement. Movement implied attack. Even if the signals were false, ignoring them risked surprise. Investigating them risked exposure. The enemy was trapped between two unacceptable options. This is known as a forced choice dilemma. When both available actions carry danger, hesitation increases. Decision-making slows. Initiative is lost. On a battlefield, hesitation spreads. Officers delayed orders. Patrols waited for confirmation. Observers double-checked what they saw. Each layer of caution added time. Time created gaps. Gaps created opportunities. The deception also exploited another weakness: responsibility. No individual wanted to be the one who ignored a real threat. Investigating and suffering losses could be blamed on enemy action. Ignoring and being surprised could be blamed on negligence. In military culture, that distinction matters. As a result, investigations continued even as casualties mounted. The psychological effect compounded. Soldiers began to associate perception itself with danger. Looking became risky. Listening became stressful. Every unexplained signal carried dread. When trust in sensory input erodes, confidence collapses. Units become reactive instead of proactive. They stop shaping the battlefield and start responding to it. This was not fear in the dramatic sense. It was fatigue, cognitive overload, the constant need to interpret without resolution. Over time, the enemy began to adapt, but adaptation required acknowledging the problem. That acknowledgement alone proved disruptive. New rules were issued, investigations were restricted, but those restrictions clashed with intelligence priorities. Command wanted awareness. Doctrine demanded caution. Soldiers were caught in between. The deception succeeded because it did not rely on surprise alone. It relied on persistence. Each small incident reinforced the last. Patterns formed not in reality, but in expectation. At this stage, the battlefield was no longer defined by terrain or firepower. It was defined by anticipation. The enemy was reacting to events that had not happened and preparing for attacks that did not exist. This is the hidden power of improvised deception. It scales. One signal affects one observer. Multiple signals affect a unit. Sustained uncertainty affects command structure. The method did not require superiority. It required understanding. Understanding how humans prioritize information. Understanding how institutions enforce behavior. Understanding how fear is often quieter than panic and far more destructive. By the time the enemy attempted to formalize countermeasures, the damage was already done. Their decision-making cycle had been compromised. And once that cycle breaks, recovery is slow. This sets the stage for escalation. Because when an enemy adapts, the deception must evolve. And when deception evolves, the consequences become far more severe than anyone initially expects. At first, the effects were local. One observer lost, one patrol delayed, one position abandoned. These incidents were troubling, but not yet alarming. Armies expect friction. They expect losses. What they do not expect is a problem that cannot be located. As the disturbances continued, patterns began to emerge, not in the jungle, but in reports. Different units described the same phenomenon using different words: strange light, unexplained movement, signals without source. Each report sounded minor on its own. Together, they suggested something new was happening. Commanders responded the only way they knew how: by tightening control. Orders emphasized discipline. Investigations were to be cautious. Exposure minimized. No unnecessary movement. But these orders collided with reality. Observation could not stop. Intelligence could not pause. The battlefield did not wait for clarity. This is where escalation truly began. The disturbances were no longer isolated. They appeared across multiple sectors, at different times, with no obvious pattern. The randomness was intentional. Predictability would have allowed adaptation. Uncertainty forced reaction. What made the situation worse was that the signals appeared meaningful. They resembled coordination. They suggested intent. They implied that something was about to happen. Commanders faced a dilemma they could not delegate. If the signals were real, ignoring them risked surprise. If they were deception, reacting risked casualties. Either choice carried consequences, and neither could be proven correct in advance. This uncertainty infected decision-making. Instead of acting decisively, units began to hedge. Patrols moved but stopped short. Observers watched longer than necessary. Officers delayed authorization while waiting for confirmation that never came. Each delay created hesitation. Each hesitation created vulnerability. Meanwhile, the deception evolved. What began as simple disruption became structured manipulation. Disturbances were timed to coincide with known routines. Supply movements, shift changes, communication windows. This made the signals harder to dismiss. They appeared when something normally happened. The effect was subtle but powerful. The enemy began to interpret coincidence as correlation. Every unexplained signal felt connected to something larger. As investigations increased, so did exposure. Observers leaned out longer. Patrols moved farther forward. Officers stepped into view to coordinate responses. The very act of trying to understand the situation created targets. The jungle did the rest. Visibility remained limited. Sound remained deceptive. Confirmation remained impossible. Each response occurred under pressure, with incomplete information. Mistakes multiplied. Reports of casualties mounted, not from firefights, from moments of investigation, from seconds of curiosity. This changed behavior. Soldiers began to fear anomalies more than known threats. A visible enemy could be engaged, an invisible one could not. The unknown demanded attention, but punished it. Morale degraded quietly. There were no dramatic collapses, no mass panic. Instead, there was fatigue, cognitive exhaustion, the constant need to interpret signals that might mean nothing or everything. Fatigue slows reaction time. It narrows focus. It increases error. In combat, those effects compound rapidly. At higher levels, command struggled to impose order. New guidelines were issued. Investigations required approval. Exposure limits were enforced. But these measures created new problems. Approval took time. Time created gaps. Gaps were exploited. Soldiers caught between conflicting priorities made inconsistent decisions. Some investigated aggressively. Others ignored signals entirely. This inconsistency made coordination difficult. Units no longer shared a common understanding of risk. The deception exploited this fragmentation. Signals began to suggest coordination between positions. Patterns implied communication. Multiple disturbances appeared in sequence, reinforcing the illusion of planning. This triggered a more serious response. Command elements became involved. When leadership engages, exposure increases. Decisions require visibility. Communication requires presence. The battlefield shifted from tactical to operational confusion. Now, the deception affected not just individual soldiers, but entire units. Movement plans were altered. Defensive positions were repositioned. Resources were allocated to counter a threat that did not exist. This is where escalation crossed a critical threshold. Once an enemy commits resources to false problems, real capabilities are weakened. Attention is finite. Time is finite. Energy is finite. Every hour spent responding to deception is an hour not spent preparing for reality. The jungle became a theater of shadows. Some signals were ignored. Others were overreacted to. No consistent rule emerged, because no rule fit all cases. The enemy could not systematize a response without first understanding the threat. And understanding required observation. The cycle fed itself. Each investigation reinforced the danger of investigating. Each ignored signal reinforced the fear of being surprised. The enemy began to doubt not just the environment, but their own judgment. This doubt spread upward. Commanders questioned reports. Reports contradicted each other. Confidence eroded. Decision-making slowed further. The deception did not need to produce casualties to be effective anymore. The damage was now systemic. At this stage, even genuine movements risked being ignored. Real signals were dismissed as false. The battlefield filled with noise, and distinguishing signal from deception became nearly impossible. This is a known effect in information warfare. When false inputs overwhelm a system, true inputs lose value. Trust collapses. The enemy faced a battlefield where perception could no longer be relied upon. Every decision felt like a gamble. Every order carried risk. Adaptation did occur. Units tried to harden discipline. Exposure was minimized further. But discipline without awareness is paralysis. The cost of safety became blindness. This created a final escalation. To compensate for reduced observation, units consolidated. They clustered. They relied more heavily on leadership presence. But clustering increased vulnerability. Leadership presence increased exposure. The deception had reshaped the battlefield without firing a single shot in many cases. What began as a method to expose individuals had become a mechanism to destabilize an entire defensive system. The enemy was reacting not to attacks, but to anticipation. At this point, the outcome was no longer about tactical success. It was about control of tempo. The side that dictated when decisions had to be made controlled the engagement. The deception dictated tempo. It forced reactions at inconvenient times. It created urgency without clarity. It drained attention continuously rather than through decisive action. This is the essence of escalation and asymmetric warfare. The weaker force does not seek decisive confrontation. It seeks cumulative pressure. By the time the enemy recognized the scope of the problem, reversing it required more than orders. It required restoring trust in perception, in doctrine, in leadership. That takes time. Time they did not have. The battlefield had already changed. And once change reaches this level, it does not simply reverse when the signals stop. The deception had achieved something more valuable than surprise. It had achieved dominance over decision-making. And that set the stage for the final phase, where consequences spread beyond the immediate fight and begin to shape doctrine, memory, and how future wars would be understood. At some point, pressure stops building and starts breaking things. The battlefield had reached that point. By now, the enemy no longer faced a series of strange incidents. They faced an environment where uncertainty was permanent. Signals appeared without explanation. Patterns formed without confirmation. Every attempt to impose order created new vulnerabilities. This was no longer a tactical problem. It was a crisis of control. Commanders demanded clarity. They wanted answers. What exactly were these signals? How were they being generated? Where was the source? But clarity requires observation, and observation had become lethal. The enemy tried to regain initiative by centralizing decisions. Authority was pulled upward. Local commanders were instructed to wait for approval before reacting. The idea was to reduce impulsive exposure. Instead, it slowed everything down. When decisions bottleneck at the top, reaction time increases. The battlefield does not pause while orders move through hierarchy. Signals still appear. Movement still happens. Uncertainty still demands response. Frontline units began to feel abandoned by procedure. They saw anomalies but were told not to act. They felt threatened but lacked permission to investigate. When casualties occurred, responsibility became diffuse. No one was clearly at fault, and that made correction impossible. At the same time, pressure on leadership increased. Higher command could not ignore repeated reports. Ignoring them risked missing a real attack. Acting on them risked exposing officers. Either choice carried reputational and operational cost. This is the moment where systems begin to cannibalize themselves. To compensate for reduced frontline initiative, commanders increased their own presence. Officers moved closer to observe directly. Coordination required visibility. Visibility required exposure. The deception anticipated this. Signals now suggested coordination at a higher level. Not random disturbances, but sequences implying command activity. The illusion was subtle but persuasive. It spoke the language of military logic. From the enemy's perspective, this was dangerous intelligence. It hinted at planning, movement, and vulnerability. It demanded attention. Attention drew leadership forward. This is where the conflict peaked. The enemy was no longer reacting as individuals. Entire command elements were now involved. Decisions carried weight. Errors had consequences beyond a single patrol. The jungle amplified the risk. Lines of sight were narrow. Confirmation remained impossible. Every assumption rested on incomplete data, and yet action was unavoidable. When leaders exposed themselves to coordinate responses, they did so under the belief that this was necessary to restore control. Instead, it accelerated collapse. Losses at this level had disproportionate impact. Even when casualties were limited, the psychological effect was severe. Leadership presence is symbolic. When it becomes dangerous, confidence erodes rapidly. Units began to behave defensively, not just in position, but in mindset. Orders became cautious. Movement slowed. Initiative vanished. Soldiers waited instead of acting. Acting felt unsafe. Waiting felt irresponsible. The enemy was trapped in a permanent hesitation loop. At the same time, the deception reached its most refined form. Disturbances were layered. Light suggested movement. Sound suggested preparation. Patterns suggested coordination. Each element reinforced the others. This was not chaos. It was controlled ambiguity. Controlled ambiguity is more dangerous than randomness. Random events can be dismissed. Ambiguous ones demand interpretation. Interpretation consumes time and attention. The enemy's decision cycle fractured. Instead of observe, decide, act, the cycle became observe, hesitate, consult, delay. By the time action occurred, conditions had changed. Signals had stopped. New ones appeared elsewhere. Nothing could be resolved. This is the moment when a force loses tempo. Tempo is not speed. It is timing, the ability to act at moments of your choosing. Once tempo is lost, reactions replace decisions. Initiative transfers to the opponent. The deception now dictated when attention was required, when urgency spiked, when resources were committed. The enemy no longer controlled their own priorities. Attempts to counter the deception grew increasingly rigid. Strict rules were imposed. Do not investigate without authorization. Do not expose unless confirmed. Do not react to isolated signals. These rules conflicted with reality. When a real threat appeared, units hesitated, fearing deception. When a false signal appeared, units debated response. In both cases, time was lost. Trust eroded. Soldiers stopped trusting what they saw. Officers stopped trusting reports. Command stopped trusting the field. Each layer questioned the one below. Once trust collapses, coordination follows. This breakdown was not dramatic. There was no single moment of failure. Instead, effectiveness leaked away. Small delays accumulated. Minor errors multiplied. By now, the deception no longer needed to produce direct results. The enemy was self-degrading. Even when disturbances stopped temporarily, their absence created anxiety. Silence became suspicious. Calm felt unnatural. The battlefield itself felt hostile. This is psychological saturation. When uncertainty persists long enough, it becomes the dominant feature of the environment. Soldiers adapt not by overcoming it, but by internalizing it. They expect confusion. They plan for doubt. But you cannot plan effectively in permanent doubt. At the peak of the conflict, the enemy faced an impossible reality. Their training, discipline, and doctrine, all strengths, had become liabilities. They were optimized for rational interpretation of signals. They now faced signals designed to be irrational. No amount of professionalism could solve that. The deception had succeeded not by overwhelming the enemy, but by exhausting their capacity to decide. Every choice felt wrong. Every delay felt dangerous. Every action carried regret. This is where control truly changed hands. The side applying deception no longer needed to force outcomes. Outcomes emerged naturally from the enemy's attempts to cope. The battlefield was now shaped by anticipation, not engagement. And once a force reaches this state, recovery requires more than tactical adjustment. It requires rebuilding confidence, trust, and decision-making authority from the ground up. That takes time. The conflict did not end with a decisive blow. It ended with exhaustion, with a quiet realization that continuing to operate under these conditions was unsustainable. The peak had passed. What followed was not victory in the traditional sense, but something more subtle and more enduring. The recognition that the rules had changed, that what worked before no longer applied. And when rules change, armies remember. That is where the consequences begin. When the pressure finally eased, it did not feel like relief. It felt like uncertainty settling into something permanent. The signals stopped appearing as frequently. The disturbances grew less intense. But the battlefield did not return to normal. Something fundamental had changed. Units that had endured sustained ambiguity did not immediately regain confidence. They had learned, painfully, that perception could not be trusted. That lesson lingered long after the deception itself faded. Commanders conducted assessments. Reports were gathered. Patterns were analyzed. What they found was unsettling. Casualties alone did not explain the degradation in effectiveness. Something else had been damaged. Decision-making. Soldiers hesitated where they once acted. Officers delayed where they once directed. Units moved cautiously even in the absence of clear threats. The environment had taught them that every anomaly could be lethal deception. This was not cowardice. It was adaptation taken too far. In trying to survive uncertainty, the force had internalized it. The most striking consequence was the collapse of initiative. Initiative depends on confidence, confidence that observation is meaningful, that action will produce predictable results. That confidence had been eroded. Even routine tasks became stressful. Patrols moved slower. Observers scanned longer. Communications increased, but clarity did not. More information flowed, yet understanding decreased. This is a known effect in systems overwhelmed by false signals. When noise dominates, signal loses authority. At higher levels, command attempted to restore order through structure. New procedures were issued. Clearer rules. Tighter control. The intent was to reduce ambiguity by standardizing response. Instead, rigidity replaced flexibility. Rigid systems handle known threats well. They fail against adaptive ones. The deception had already proven that unpredictability was the battlefield's defining feature. Formal rules could not keep pace. As a result, the force entered a holding pattern. Not defeated, but constrained. Not destroyed, but diminished. The psychological toll was evident. Soldiers reported fatigue unrelated to physical exertion. The exhaustion came from constant vigilance, from never being able to relax attention, from the inability to distinguish danger from illusion. This kind of fatigue accumulates quietly. It does not manifest as panic. It manifests as numbness, a dulling of response, a desire to avoid decision altogether. In combat, that is dangerous. Commanders recognized that restoring effectiveness required more than new orders. It required rebuilding trust in observation, in judgment, in leadership. That process takes time and stability, neither of which the environment offered. Meanwhile, the opposing force drew conclusions of its own. What had begun as improvisation was now understood as principle. Reports emphasized not the tools used, but the logic behind them. The deception worked because it exploited how humans prioritize information under stress. This insight mattered. It suggested that superiority in equipment was not always decisive. That understanding the enemy's decision cycle could produce outsized effects. That small, persistent disruptions could achieve what direct confrontation could not. These lessons were documented. They were discussed in briefings, training sessions, and after-action analyses, not as anecdotes, but as examples of how asymmetric pressure could destabilize larger systems. The focus shifted from individual success to replicable logic. How do you force an enemy to react? How do you create false urgency? How do you overload attention without revealing intent? These questions began to shape thinking beyond the immediate context. The impact extended beyond tactics. It challenged assumptions about control. Traditional doctrine assumes that commanders can impose order through discipline and hierarchy. This episode demonstrated that control can be undermined indirectly, without confronting authority head-on. It also reframed the role of creativity in combat. Creativity had often been treated as secondary to discipline. Useful, but risky. Here, it proved decisive. Not reckless creativity, but disciplined improvisation grounded in understanding human behavior. The lesson was uncomfortable. It suggested that rigid adherence to procedure could become a liability when facing adaptive threats. That thinking mattered as much as training. That perception itself could be weaponized. For those who experienced it, the memory endured. They remembered a battlefield where nothing could be taken at face value, where every signal carried doubt, where certainty was impossible. That memory influenced behavior long after the fighting moved elsewhere. Units became more cautious, more skeptical, more aware of deception as a constant possibility. In some cases, this made them more resilient. In others, it made them slower. The consequences were not uniformly positive or negative. They were complex. This complexity is why the episode mattered. It did not produce a clear victory or a decisive defeat. It produced a shift in understanding, a recognition that warfare is not only about destroying forces, but about shaping how the enemy thinks, decides, and reacts. The jungle had revealed something fundamental. You do not need to control the enemy's actions if you can control their choices. And you do not need to control their choices if you can control what they believe is happening. That realization lingered. It informed future planning. It influenced training philosophy. It became part of the institutional memory that shapes how wars are approached. Long after the last disturbance faded, the effect remained embedded in doctrine, in cautionary notes, in quiet references to the dangers of overconfidence in perception. The battlefield had returned to silence. But silence no longer felt safe, and that is the most enduring consequence of all. When the fighting moved on, the jungle reclaimed the ground. Light returned to being just light. Sound returned to being just sound. The battlefield looked ordinary again, but for those who had lived through it, nothing felt ordinary. What lingered was not fear of attack, but doubt. Doubt in perception. Doubt in instinct. Doubt in the idea that seeing something meant understanding it. That doubt is the true legacy of this story. Most people imagine warfare as a contest of strength. Bigger armies, better weapons, faster machines. But beneath all of that is something more fragile and more decisive. How humans interpret the world around them under pressure. This episode revealed a quiet truth. War is not only fought in physical space, it is fought inside the decision-making loop of the human mind. The deception did not succeed because it was clever. It succeeded because it was persistent, restrained, and psychologically precise. It did not overwhelm. It accumulated. It did not shock. It exhausted. By forcing the enemy to constantly question what they were seeing, it transformed awareness from an advantage into a burden. Attention became dangerous. Curiosity became lethal. Discipline became a trap. This is why the lesson extends far beyond the jungle. Modern warfare relies even more heavily on perception. Sensors, feeds, alerts, signals, data streams. The battlefield is now flooded with information, but the human brain processing that information has not changed. It still seeks patterns. It still reacts to anomalies. It still struggles when signals cannot be verified. The same dilemma remains. Investigate and risk exposure. Ignore and risk blindness. This is not just a military problem. It is a human one. In any system under stress, false signals can be as damaging as real threats. When noise overwhelms clarity, trust erodes. When trust erodes, decision-making slows. When decision-making slows, control shifts. The jungle incident demonstrated this at a small scale, but the principle scales upward. It shows why superior technology does not guarantee dominance, why rigid doctrine can fail against adaptive thinking, why creativity, when grounded in understanding human behavior, can outperform resources. It also reveals something uncomfortable. The most effective strategies are not always the most visible. They do not announce themselves with explosions or victories. They work quietly, reshaping how the enemy thinks until resistance weakens on its own. That kind of success is harder to measure. It does not always appear in statistics or headlines, but it changes outcomes all the same. This is why the story endures. Not because of what was used, but because of what was understood. The individuals involved did not see themselves as innovators. They were solving immediate problems with limited tools. But in doing so, they exposed a vulnerability that exists wherever humans must decide under uncertainty. They showed that control does not always come from force. Sometimes, it comes from forcing the other side to choose between two bad options, again and again, until choice itself becomes exhausting. In the end, the battlefield teaches the same lesson it always has. The side that understands the human mind better does not just win engagements, it shapes the environment in which all future decisions are made. The jungle returned to silence. The objects used faded away, but the idea remained. Because once you learn that perception can be weaponized, you never see the battlefield the same way again. And that raises a final question. If wars are decided not only by what we do, but by how we force others to think, then how many battles in history were lost long before the first shot was fired? If this story changed the way you think about warfare, share it with someone who believes battles are won only by firepower. And subscribe to History Why for more deep dives into the ideas that quietly shape history.